I took the call while I was slicing apples at the kitchen counter, the late afternoon light spilling through the window in a way that made everything look softer than it really was. My son was at the small table behind me, humming to himself, lining up his toy cars with the kind of focus only a child his age could manage. When the phone vibrated, I almost ignored it. Something in me already knew the call wouldn't bring good news. It never did when the kindergarten number flashed on the screen. I wiped my hands on a towel, answered, and heard the careful, measured voice of his teacher, the tone people use when they don't want to scare you but also don't want to lie. She said there had been an incident, a misunderstanding, she called it at first. My son had been pushed during outdoor play and there were marks on his arm. Not serious, she added quickly, but enough that they thought I should know. I stared at the apple slices, suddenly unable to remember how long I'd been standing there. My son looked up, smiling, unaware that his whole little world had just cracked open. I asked who the other child was. There was a pause, the kind that tells you more than words ever could. Then she said a name that dropped into my chest like a stone. A name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, but one that still lived rent-free in the darker corners of my memory. My ex-husband's last name. I told her I'd be there in 20 minutes and hung up before she could say anything else. My hands were shaking as I knelt in front of my son and told him we were going to take a short drive. He asked if he was in trouble. I told him no, and meant it with every fiber of my being. On the way to the school, I replayed years of my life I thought I had neatly filed away. The marriage that ended quietly on paper but loudly in my head. The promises made and broken. The version of myself I had been back then, smaller, softer, always trying to keep the peace. The school smelled like disinfectant and crayons, a strange mix that usually made me smile. That day it made my stomach turn. They led me to a small room near the nurse's office. My son sat on a bench, his feet not quite touching the floor. When he saw me, his face changed. Not tears, not yet, just relief. I saw the red marks on his arm, fingerprints if I was being honest with myself, and something hot and sharp moved through my chest. I crouched down, pulled him into me, and listened as he whispered that he hadn't done anything wrong. I told him I knew. They said the other parent was already in the principal's office. I didn't need to ask who that was. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it was, each step bringing me closer to a confrontation I hadn't planned for but somehow felt inevitable. When I opened the door, the past and present collided in a way that made the room feel smaller. My ex-husband stood there, polished and calm, the same expression he used to wear when he thought he was in control. Beside him was his new wife, her hand resting possessively on the shoulder of their child, the one who had hurt my son. There were apologies offered, but they were thin, wrapped in excuses about kids being kids and misunderstandings on the playground. I listened quietly, because listening has always been my strength. But as they talked, I watched my son cling to my leg, his fingers curled into the fabric of my jeans like he was afraid I might disappear. Something shifted then. I realized that staying quiet, staying polite, staying small had never protected me before. It certainly wasn't going to protect him now. My ex-husband looked at me the way he used to when we disagreed, like I was overreacting, like my feelings were an inconvenience. His wife suggested my son might have provoked it. That was when I felt the last thread snap. I knelt in front of my child, put my hands on his shoulders, and spoke clearly, calmly, and loud enough for everyone in that room to hear. I told him that if someone ever put their hands on him again, he was allowed to defend himself. That he did not have to stand still and be hurt to make adults comfortable. I told him to fight back. The room went silent. Shock flickered across faces that weren't used to hearing a mother say something like that out loud. My ex-husband was the first to recover. He accused me of encouraging violence, of being dramatic, of turning a small issue into something bigger than it needed to be. I looked at him and felt nothing like the fear I used to feel. I felt clarity. I told him that teaching a child to protect themselves was not violence, it was survival. That silence had never kept anyone safe. If you're still listening right now and you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people, because stories like this don't get told enough. The principal tried to smooth things over, suggested mediation, suggested we all calm down. But calm was a luxury I no longer valued more than my child's safety. I asked what consequences would follow. I asked how they planned to prevent this from happening again. The answers were vague. My ex-husband shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, with the possibility that this wasn't going to disappear the way he wanted it to. For the first time in a long time, I held my ground without apology. We left the school with a promise of investigation and a meeting scheduled for the following week. In the car, my son asked if he had done something bad. I pulled over, turned to him, and told him something I wish someone had told me when I was young. I told him that protecting yourself is not wrong, that asking for help is not weakness, that his feelings matter, even when they make other people uncomfortable. He nodded, serious, absorbing it in the quiet way kids do. That night after he fell asleep, I sat alone and let the weight of it all settle. The bullying wasn't just on the playground. It was in the way adults minimized harm, in the way power dynamics played out quietly, favoring those who knew how to smile and deflect. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Co-parenting with someone who refused to acknowledge harm never is. But I also knew something fundamental had changed. I wasn't raising a child to be palatable. I was raising a child to be safe. I didn't know then how far this situation would go, how many lines it would force me to draw, or how many old wounds it would reopen. I only knew that I had chosen my side without hesitation. And once you do that, once you choose your child over comfort, there's no going back. The next morning began with an email that looked polite enough on the surface, but carried the unmistakable weight of institutional discomfort. The school wanted to clarify events, to ensure that all perspectives were heard. I read it twice while sipping coffee that had already gone cold, my mind translating the careful language into what it really meant. They were nervous. Not about my son, not really, but about balance, reputation, and the quiet fear that comes when parents with history collide inside a building designed for finger painting and nap time. I forwarded the email to my personal folder and didn't respond right away. I had learned, the hard way, that speed often benefits the wrong people. My son ate his breakfast slowly, unusually quiet. When I asked how he felt, he shrugged, then admitted he didn't want to go back. The words were small, but they landed hard. Fear doesn't always look dramatic in children. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation, as a sudden reluctance to do things they loved the week before. I knelt beside him and told him he wouldn't go back until I was sure he'd be safe. His shoulders relaxed just a little. That was all the confirmation I needed that I was doing the right thing. By mid-morning, my ex-husband called. I hadn't saved his number, but muscle memory recognized it instantly. I let it ring once longer than necessary before answering. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He said I had embarrassed him, that his wife was upset, that the school was talking. I listened without interrupting, letting him talk himself into a corner the way he always did. When he finally paused, waiting for me to apologize or soften, I told him calmly that his discomfort ranked far below my child's safety. He accused me of poisoning our son against him. I reminded him that bruises and fear do that well enough on their own. What surprised me wasn't his anger, but his confusion. He genuinely seemed unable to grasp why this was different from the countless other moments he'd smoothed over in his life with money, charm, or silence. I realized then that he wasn't malicious in the cartoon villain sense. He was something more dangerous, accustomed to his version of reality being the one that stuck, accustomed to women being reasonable, accommodating, flexible. I wasn't any of those things anymore. The school meeting was scheduled for 2 days later. In the meantime, messages started to trickle in. Other parents, ones I barely knew, reached out quietly. Some said they'd seen things. Others said their children had mentioned the same boy being rough, pushing, taking toys. They hadn't said anything before, afraid of making waves, afraid of labels. Reading those messages, I felt a strange mix of validation and anger. How many kids had learned to shrink because adults were too polite to be honest? The day of the meeting, I walked into the school with a notebook and a calm I didn't entirely feel. My ex-husband and his wife were already there, seated close together like a united front. The principal greeted us with practiced neutrality. We went over timelines, reports, language sanitized to the point of absurdity. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I described my son's fear, the marks on his body, the change in his behavior. I asked what steps would be taken to ensure this didn't happen again, not just for my child, but for any child. My ex-husband's wife rolled her eyes when she thought no one was looking. She said children need to learn resilience, that the world wouldn't always protect them. I agreed with her, and then added that resilience doesn't grow in environments where harm is dismissed. It grows when children know adults will intervene when lines are crossed. The room went quiet. The principal scribbled notes. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just advocating for my son, but for every kid whose fear had been explained away. If you believe she deserved justice, comment justice below, because silence is exactly what lets situations like this continue. The outcome wasn't immediate or dramatic. The school implemented a supervision plan, adjusted schedules, and mandated behavioral support for the other child. It wasn't expulsion, and part of me wanted more, but another part recognized progress when it appeared. More importantly, my son returned to school with a sense that he wasn't alone. That mattered. At home, we talked about boundaries in ways that felt age-appropriate but honest. I told him it was okay to say no, that it was okay to tell a teacher, to tell me, to use his voice even if it shook. He asked if his dad was mad at me. I told him adults sometimes get mad when they're asked to change. That didn't mean the request was wrong. Weeks passed. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted. My ex-husband became more careful, more guarded. His wife avoided me entirely. Other parents nodded at me in hallways, a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding. One afternoon, my son came home and told me he'd told another child to stop when they grabbed his backpack. He said it firmly, he said, and the child stopped. Pride swelled in my chest, not because he had confronted someone, but because he knew he was allowed to. Late one evening, after he'd gone to bed, I thought about the woman I used to be. The one who would have smoothed things over, accepted half apologies, worried about being labeled difficult. I felt compassion for her, but no desire to return. Parenthood had stripped away my tolerance for injustice dressed up as convenience. It had taught me that being liked is optional, but being present is not. I don't know what the future holds with my ex-husband. Co-parenting with unresolved power struggles is rarely simple. But I know this. My child knows I will choose him every time. He knows his body and feelings are his own. And that knowledge, once planted, is hard to uproot. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in through small moments, the kind that don't announce themselves but leave a lasting imprint. My son started sleeping through the night again. He stopped asking if I'd be late to pick him up. He laughed more freely, the sound lighter, unburdened. Watching him, I realized how much children absorb, how closely they watch the adults around them to learn what's acceptable. He wasn't just recovering from being pushed on a playground. He was recalibrating his understanding of safety, of trust, of whether the world would step in when things went wrong. My ex-husband, on the other hand, seemed to be unraveling in quieter ways. He began insisting on more structured drop-offs, more documentation, more formality. It was as if he were trying to regain control through process, through rules that favored him. I complied where it made sense and pushed back where it didn't. Each boundary I set felt like a small reclamation of space I'd once surrendered too easily. He accused me of being inflexible. I accused him of confusing flexibility with erasure. One afternoon, a different parent approached me in the parking lot. She looked nervous, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. She thanked me, said her daughter had been dealing with similar behavior and that my willingness to speak up had made her reconsider staying silent. I felt a lump form in my throat. It was one thing to fight for your own child. It was another to realize your actions might ripple outward, giving others permission to do the same. That's when I understood why systems resist change so fiercely. Silence is efficient. Courage is contagious. The school sent out a general communication about updated playground policies. No names mentioned, no specifics, just a broad statement about safety and respect. My ex-husband forwarded it to me with a message that said, "Happy now?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. I told him happiness had nothing to do with it. Accountability did. He didn't respond. At home, conversations with my son evolved. We talked about emotions, about recognizing when someone else was acting out of their own hurt. I made sure he knew that understanding someone's feelings didn't mean tolerating harmful behavior. Those two things are often conflated, especially when adults want to avoid discomfort. I refused to teach him that lesson. Instead, I taught him discernment, compassion with boundaries, empathy without self-erasure. There were moments I doubted myself. Late nights when the house was quiet and old fears resurfaced. What if I'd made things harder for him in the long run? What if standing up marked him as different? Those doubts never lasted long. They couldn't compete with the certainty I felt when I watched him walk into school with his head held a little higher, when he told me about his day without hesitation, when he trusted me with the truth. My ex-husband's wife eventually confronted me directly. It happened unexpectedly, outside a grocery store of all places. She accused me of turning everyone against her family, of enjoying the attention. I listened, then told her something she clearly wasn't prepared to hear. I told her this was never about her. It was about a child learning whether adults would protect him. I said if that made her uncomfortable, she should sit with that feeling instead of trying to offload it onto me. She left without another word. If you want to see all targets hit at once, type yes, because moments like this don't happen in isolation. They build. As weeks turned into months, the intensity faded, replaced by a steady resolve. The other child's behavior improved, according to the school. I hoped that was true, not just for my son's sake, but for his as well. Children aren't villains, they're mirrors. They reflect what they're taught, what they see modeled. I wondered what lessons he was absorbing at home, what narratives were being reinforced. I couldn't control that. I could only control how I showed up for my own child. Friends asked me how I'd found the courage to say what I did in that office. I didn't feel courageous. I felt cornered. Courage, I learned, often shows up when retreat is no longer an option, when the cost of silence outweighs the fear of speaking. Parenthood has a way of clarifying priorities with brutal efficiency. Suddenly, the risk you're willing to take shifts dramatically. There were still awkward moments. School events where we stood on opposite sides of the room, polite smiles masking unresolved tension. But there was also growth. In me, in my son, in the quiet confidence that settled into our routines. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped anticipating conflict that might never come. I trusted myself more. Trusted that even if things got messy again, I'd handle them. One evening, as I tucked my son into bed, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. He asked if standing up for himself made him brave. I told him bravery isn't about never being scared. It's about listening to that scared feeling and deciding to act anyway. He thought about that for a moment, then smiled. That smile was worth every uncomfortable conversation, every raised eyebrow, every accusation of being difficult. Looking back, I see how easily this could have gone differently. How close I came to minimizing, to rationalizing, to telling him to ignore it and move on. That path would have been smoother in the short term. Less conflict, fewer tense meetings, but it would have taught him a lesson I refused to pass down. That peace is more important than safety. That other people's comfort should come before your own well-being. I broke that cycle deliberately. This wasn't a story about a playground scuffle. It was about power, about whose voice gets prioritized, about what we model for the next generation. It was about refusing to let history repeat itself quietly. And it was only one chapter in a much longer story, one that continues to unfold with every choice I make as a parent, as a woman, as someone who finally understands the weight and value of her own voice. The longer this went on, the more I realized how deeply moments like this embed themselves into family histories. Long after the bruises fade and the meetings end, the story you tell yourself becomes the inheritance. I watched my son navigate his world with new awareness, noticing how he paid closer attention to tone, to posture, to the subtle signals adults often overlook. He was learning discernment, not distrust, and that distinction mattered. It meant he was growing sharper, not smaller. My ex-husband, however, seemed determined to rewrite the narrative. He began telling mutual acquaintances that I was overreactive, that I had a tendency to dramatize. It was familiar territory. I'd lived in the shadow of that framing for years, always second-guessing myself, always wondering if my reactions were too much. This time, though, the words slid off me. I knew the truth, and more importantly, my son knew it too. Gaslighting loses its power when the target is grounded in reality. At a parent-teacher night a few weeks later, I noticed something else. Teachers were more attentive, more proactive. They checked in with children more often, intervened sooner. Whether it was policy or awareness, I didn't care. The environment felt safer, and that was the goal. One of the teachers pulled me aside and thanked me for being honest, for pushing when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Her words weren't dramatic, just sincere. Sometimes change looks like that. small acknowledgments that signal a larger shift. If you think stories like this should be shared so communities understand what was hiding beneath polite silence, share this video so the conversation doesn't end here. At home, I found myself reflecting on the generational patterns that had led me to this point. I grew up watching women smooth things over, absorb discomfort, sacrifice boundaries for harmony. I learned early that being agreeable was safer than being truthful. Unlearning that took years, and motherhood accelerated the process in ways nothing else could. When you see your child facing the same pressures, the same subtle expectations to shrink, the urgency becomes undeniable. My son started asking deeper questions. Why do some kids hurt others? Why don't adults always stop it right away? We talked about fear, about power, about how sometimes people make excuses because admitting a problem would require them to change. I kept the answers simple but honest. Children are capable of understanding more than we give them credit for, especially when explanations respect their intelligence. The dynamic with my ex-husband continued to evolve. He oscillated between defensiveness and forced civility, never quite acknowledging the core issue. There were moments I wished he would, moments I imagined a conversation where accountability replaced ego. Those moments passed. Acceptance, I learned, isn't about approving of someone's behavior. It's about releasing the expectation that they'll become who you need them to be. I focused on what I could control: my responses, my boundaries, my consistency. There was an incident later in the year that tested everything I'd worked toward. Another child lashed out during a group activity, shouting and knocking over supplies. The room erupted in chaos. My son froze for a split second, then did something that made my heart swell. He stepped back, raised his voice just enough to be heard, and said, "Stop! That's not okay." A teacher intervened immediately. The situation diffused. When he told me about it later, his eyes were bright, not with pride exactly, but with relief. He had trusted his instincts, and the world had responded appropriately. If this shocked you, comment brave below, because moments like that don't happen by accident. I realized then that the real victory wasn't about winning an argument with my ex-husband or forcing a school to change its policies. It was about equipping my child with an internal compass that would serve him long after kindergarten. It was about showing him, through action, that his voice mattered, that he didn't need permission to protect himself, that love sometimes looks like confrontation, and that's okay. The ripple effects extended beyond our immediate circle. I heard through other parents that conversations were happening at home, that children were talking about boundaries and respect in new ways. The idea that one honest moment could spark that kind of dialogue humbled me. It reminded me that change rarely announces itself with fanfare. It moves quietly, carried by people willing to endure discomfort for the sake of something better. There were setbacks, of course, days when exhaustion crept in, when I longed for simplicity. Standing firm takes energy, and there were times I felt depleted. On those days, I leaned into routines, into the ordinary comforts that ground us: reading together before bed, cooking dinner side by side, laughing at nothing in particular. Those moments replenished what conflict drained. As the year drew to a close, I attended a small assembly at the school. Children sang off-key songs, parents smiled and clapped. I watched my son on stage, confident, unafraid. I thought about the version of myself who once would have prioritized keeping the peace at any cost. I felt gratitude for how far I'd come, for the clarity that had emerged from conflict. Growth often arrives disguised as challenge. This experience reshaped my understanding of justice. It's not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it's the quiet assurance that you did the right thing, even when it was hard. Sometimes it's watching your child internalize a lesson you never learned at their age. Sometimes it's knowing that by refusing to stay silent, you made space for others to speak. I don't pretend to have all the answers. Parenting is an ongoing negotiation with uncertainty. But I know this: I will never regret choosing my child's safety over social comfort. I will never regret telling him he has the right to defend himself. Those choices form the backbone of the person he's becoming. By the time spring arrived, the intensity of everything that had happened had settled into something quieter, but no less significant. It showed up in the way my son carried himself, in the way he spoke about school as a place he belonged rather than a place he endured. It showed up in me too, in how I no longer rehearsed conversations before they happened or apologized for feelings that didn't need defending. There was a steadiness between us, a shared understanding that whatever came next, we would face it honestly. My ex-husband tried one last time to reassert control, though he framed it as concern. He suggested therapy for our son, implied that the incident might have affected him more than necessary. The implication was clear. The problem wasn't the behavior, it was my response. I told him therapy wasn't a bad idea, but not for the reasons he thought. Learning to process experiences openly is a strength, not a sign of damage. He didn't like that answer. He rarely liked answers that didn't fit his narrative. What struck me most was how differently I handled these exchanges compared to the past. There was no spike of anxiety, no urge to justify myself beyond what was necessary. Boundaries, once established, tend to reinforce themselves. Each time I held one, it became easier to hold the next. This wasn't something I'd learned overnight. It was the cumulative result of choosing clarity over comfort again and again. At school, my son's teacher shared an observation during a routine check-in. She said he'd become a kind of quiet leader among his peers, someone other children looked to when conflicts arose. Not because he was loud or dominant, but because he was calm and direct. I thanked her and felt that familiar swell of emotion, the kind that catches you off guard. This wasn't about vindication. It was about witnessing growth in real time. The irony wasn't lost on me. The incident that had begun with fear and anger had ultimately fostered resilience and empathy, not just in my child, but in me. I'd always believed strength looked like endurance, like absorbing blows without complaint. Now I understood it could look like refusal, like saying no, like choosing a different pattern even when it disrupted the familiar. Friends sometimes asked if I worried about long-term consequences, about labeling or stigma. I told them the only label that mattered to me was whether my child felt safe enough to be himself. Everything else was noise. Children are remarkably perceptive. They know when adults are being honest with them, and they know when they're being managed for convenience. I refused to manage my son's reality to keep others comfortable. As the school year wound down, there was a final meeting, more procedural than emotional. Policies were reviewed, feedback collected. I spoke when asked, succinctly, without the fire that had fueled earlier conversations. That fire had done its job. What remained was resolve. My ex-husband barely met my eyes, and I didn't chase the acknowledgement. Closure, I learned, doesn't always come from the people who hurt you. Sometimes it comes from the person you become, after refusing to accept the hurt as normal. If this story made you pause or rethink what you'd do in a similar situation, comment strong below. Not for me, but for every parent navigating these moments quietly. On the last day of kindergarten, I watched my son run across the playground, carefree, confident. The same space that had once felt threatening now felt reclaimed. I knew challenges lay ahead. Growing up is never free of conflict. But I also knew he carried tools now that would serve him well. Tools I wished I'd had at his age. Driving home that afternoon, he talked excitedly about summer plans, about things that felt wonderfully ordinary. I listened, grateful for the ordinariness. Trauma has a way of distorting perspective, making calm feel suspicious. I let myself enjoy it. Healing, I realized, often looks like a return to the mundane. Later that evening, after he'd fallen asleep, I reflected on the journey we'd taken together. It wasn't one I would have chosen, but it was one that had reshaped us both. I thought about the parents who had reached out, the teachers who had adjusted, the quiet shifts that might never make headlines but mattered deeply to the children living them. Change doesn't require perfection. It requires participation. I don't share this story because I think I handled everything flawlessly. I share it because I know how isolating these moments can feel. How easy it is to doubt yourself when authority figures minimize your concerns. How tempting it is to tell your child to ignore, to endure, to stay quiet. I want other parents to know there is another option, one that prioritizes dignity over decorum. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't expected. Not an ending, but a chapter closing. Whatever challenges awaited us, I trusted our ability to meet them with honesty and courage. That trust was the real gift this experience had given me. As summer settled in, life slowed in ways that felt unfamiliar after months of emotional intensity. The days were longer, quieter, filled with small rituals that stitched us back into something resembling normal. My son spent mornings drawing at the kitchen table, afternoons riding his bike up and down the sidewalk, calling out to me just to make sure I was still there. I always answered. That reassurance, simple as it seemed, had become part of our language now. Every so often, the past months would resurface in unexpected ways. A comment from another parent, a news story about bullying shared in a group chat. Each time I noticed how differently I reacted. There was no spike of adrenaline, no urge to jump into defense mode. I could observe without reliving. That, I realized, was its own form of healing. When an experience no longer hijacks your nervous system, it loosens its grip on your life. My ex-husband faded into the background during those weeks. Fewer messages, shorter exchanges. I suspected he was recalibrating, adjusting to a version of me that no longer responded to pressure the way I once had. I didn't take it personally. People often retreat when they lose leverage. What mattered was that our communication had become functional, stripped of manipulation. It wasn't warm, but it was clear. One afternoon, as my son and I sat on the porch watching the sky change colors, he asked a question that stopped me cold. He asked if standing up for himself meant he was being mean. I told him no. I told him being mean is about intent, about wanting to hurt someone. Standing up for yourself is about wanting to protect what matters. He nodded, satisfied, then leaned against me in that effortless way children do when they feel safe. In that moment, every difficult conversation, every sleepless night, felt worth it. I thought about how easily this could have gone another way. How easily I could have taught him to swallow discomfort, to doubt his instincts, to prioritize other people's reactions over his own well-being. That realization stayed with me. Parenting isn't just about what you say in big moments. It's about what your actions consistently reinforce. Children watch what you tolerate. They internalize what you normalize. As the weeks passed, messages continued to come in from people I barely knew. Parents thanking me. Parents sharing their own stories, often in hushed tones, as if afraid to speak too loudly even now. I responded when I could, offering empathy rather than advice. Everyone's situation is different, but the common thread was unmistakable. Too many people had been taught that silence was safer than truth. Too many children had learned that lesson early. If this shocked you, comment enough below, because the cycle only breaks when someone decides it has to. There was a quiet pride that grew inside me, not loud or boastful, but steady. Pride in having trusted myself. Pride in choosing discomfort over regret. Pride in knowing that my son would grow up with a different blueprint than the one I inherited. I didn't need public validation or dramatic closure. The real evidence was in the everyday moments, the way he spoke up, the way he rested easily, the way he knew without being told that his feelings mattered. I also learned something about forgiveness, though it wasn't the kind people often expect. I didn't forgive my ex-husband in a sweeping, cinematic way. I forgave myself for staying quiet for as long as I did. I forgave the version of me who didn't yet know she could demand more. That forgiveness created space for growth, for compassion without self-betrayal. It allowed me to move forward without carrying bitterness as an identity. On the last night before summer camp began, I tucked my son into bed and lingered longer than usual. He asked me if I'd always be on his side. I told him yes, but I also told him something else. I told him that one day, he wouldn't need me to fight every battle for him because he'd have his own voice, his own sense of right and wrong. He smiled, already half asleep, trusting that future version of himself without fear. As I turned off the light, I understood that this story was never just about bullying or co-parenting or a moment of confrontation. It was about rewriting a pattern, about choosing presence over passivity, about teaching a child, through lived example, that love doesn't mean silence and strength doesn't mean hardness. It means honesty, consistency, and the courage to act when it matters most. Before you go, take a moment with me. If this story resonated, hit like so more parents who need this message can find it. Comment and tell me what you would do if it were your child, because your voice might give someone else the courage to speak. And subscribe, not just for more stories, but to be part of a community that believes protecting children is always worth the discomfort.